All right, now that we have spent a little bit of time thinking about what is metaphysics, what is ontology, what does it mean to give a philosophical analysis or a definition of some concept, let's apply this and turn our focus to the question of what is food. What is going to be a good definition, a good philosophical analysis of the essence of food? So that'll be the focus for this particular video. So, to begin, when we're thinking about the metaphysical question of what is food, we might start with a fairly intuitive definition, what we will call the nutritional definition of food. It tells us that food is understood to be the biological properties that provide for humans and non human animals and plants nutrition. Right. So we might just simply say it's anything that provides for humans and non human animals nutritional or biological benefits. And that seems fairly intuitive insofar as it helps us live a good life. It helps us obtain some sort of a healthy way of living. So while this may be a rather intuitive definition, it seems kind of like a common sense place to start. We can still ask whether or not it counts as a good philosophical definition. Right? Consider the following sort of counterexample. According to this nutritional definition, it looks like poop is going to count as food. And that seems sort of strange. Would you include poop in how you're thinking about food? I think most people would say no. But interestingly, we actually use feces as a medical procedure, right? It's commonly used in what we call microbiota transplantation or FMT. This is used to treat different infections, which are severe bacterial infections of the gut. In these sorts of cases of FMT, what happens is we take processed stool from a healthy donor and then introduce it into a patient's intestines in order to restore them to having a healthy gut. Right. So, in that sense, then the word food, this concept of food, strictly speaking, would include poop according to the nutritional definition. But that just seems absurd, right? That seems like it should not count as being a part of what we are thinking of as food. So then you can see that even a basic definition that seems intuitive, seems like a good kind of common sense place to start, isn't always going to count as a good philosophical analysis. So now let's turn our attention to a dictionary definition. Most dictionaries are going to define food in terms of any kind of nutritious substance that people or animals eat or drink or that plants absorb in order to maintain life and growth. It'll probably also say something along the lines of a general term for all matters taken into the body for nourishment. But notice that this definition is ambiguous, right? It does not clearly distinguish between two different kinds of definitions. On the one hand, we have natural kinds, and on the other hand, we have functional kinds. These are two different kinds of definitions that philosophers use. So let's spell that out in a little more detail. A natural kind, philosophically speaking, is a concept or a category, a term that reflects natural chemical or biological divisions in nature rather than merely humanly imposed groupings or classifications, right? So a natural kind groups entities that share some essential intrinsic property or set of properties, whatever makes it that thing. Of course, there may be some worry about circularity here, and that's because we haven't specifically defined or spelled out what those essential or intrinsic properties are, right? If we're looking for the essential nature of food, then it's not going to be good enough to just say it's whatever the essential or intrinsic properties are. That's what we're trying to define. But at this point, we're just thinking about it in terms of what natural kinds are, not food as a natural kind. So the basic idea then is that these categories, in some sense, are supposed to carve reality at its joints. They're the things in reality that separate this from that. From chemical A from chemical B, or compound A from compound B. They're the joints that separate different entities or classifications. Right. So let's look at some examples. right? We've got something like water, which is defined in terms of its chemical compounds of H2O. Right, that's why chemistry is really helpful in thinking of natural kinds or biological kinds. We also have something like gold, which we can define in terms of its atomic number 79. And that will help us, distinguish something like gold from fool's gold because it has a different atomic number. We can also do this in terms of biological entities like mammals, right? All mammals are going to share the same essential biological properties that is, are able to make them in this category or classification rather than something else like a fish or a reptile, right? So again, they're going to be those biological properties, whatever they happen to be. And we can do this with species as well, like a tiger. Tigers belong to the same biological species insofar as they share the same essential genetic traits. So, whatever those happen to be, if they have them, whatever those genetic traits are, then it's going to count as that species rather than another species. There may be some worries and some problems with these, but I think the basic idea should be clear. But another example, which I think is really helpful in thinking about what a natural kind is or what a biological kind is a pretty controversial example, but I think it's going to help to spell some of these details out. And this is the notion of biological sex, right? What distinguishes a biological male from a biological female or something else. Right. This is going to be a classification of an organism based upon its reproductively related biological properties, right? So, for instance, we've got chromosomes like the XY, XX, and there may be some exceptions as well. We've got other things that help us distinguish reproductively one sex from another, like ovaries or testes, or primary reproductive anatomy, or the secondary sexual characteristics that we can appeal to. These are all going to be sort of properties or ways of distinguishing and classifying different biological entities. So that's one way to understand biological sex. But now distinguish this understanding of biological sex, understood in terms of a natural or biological kind, from what we would call gender, where gender is understood as a social kind, a social construction rather than some biological or natural entity. Again, this is controversial, but I think going through how some philosophers understand these notions is helpful here. So, gender refers to the social and cultural categories, something like man or woman or non binary. These are ways of organizing how people understand themselves or how people identify themselves, the roles or expectations that they experience in society. Right? Gender categorizes different aspects of social practices or social norms and institutions, right? This is a way of categorizing individuals not by the intrinsic biological properties, but by the way they behave in society or the social expectations that they have. Right. They reflect social meanings, whatever meanings we happen to give to them. Right. So, what we mean by woman in one society may differ from what we mean by woman in another society. This is not true for the natural or biological properties, or what we might call the essence of something like a man or a woman, right? They vary across cultures and across histories. This seems to be clear. Some societies recognize more than one gender, other societies only recognize two, and different genders have different roles throughout history, right? There have been plenty of different times and different cultures throughout history when men wear dresses or when women don't wear dresses, right? This is something that seems fairly obvious. And various social expectations are placed upon individuals in society as well, right? So, for instance, it's common in our contemporary society for women to be expected to be nurturing, whereas men are expected to be assertive, right? These are expectations that may vary from one society to another, and they're not natural laws or biological properties. Rather, they're ways of socially assigning various roles to individuals. So, my goal in introducing this very controversial example is to help us get clear about what we mean with regard to natural kinds. So, now let's think about whether or not food is going to count as a natural kind. According to the way that Plakus describes food as a natural kind, we can say that food is the ability to nourish us and depends on its chemical properties. Things like water, fats, carbohydrates, proteins. These are all the main chemical building blocks of nutrition. Now, I do want to make it clear that she's just describing one way of defining food in terms of this sort of natural kind approach. That's not necessarily an endorsement on her part. She's merely putting it out there so that way we can give an analysis of it to see whether or not it's going to count as a good definition. Right, so we can define food in terms of its natural or biological properties. This is the way we might do that. The collection of all substances, actual and possible, known and unknown, that are capable of providing nourishment. Right, we've got some of these properties, things like waters, fats, proteins. These are going to be the building blocks, these chemical compounds that we use to provide nourishment for animals or non-human animals, anything that needs these to grow. But if we are going to include even those possible properties, those possible things that could provide nourishment, whether they're known or unknown, then what that means is we actually have a long string of properties or a long string of different substances that provide nourishment. And this is going to be a disjunctive definition, which would look something like this: A or B or C or D or E or whatever else. Notice that what we have here are variables that are disjoined, right? The or is telling us that it could be this or that thing, and it looks like it's fairly indefinite. Now, sometimes a disjunctive definition is actually pretty helpful. For instance, in the case of jade, for a long time, we thought that jade was just jadeite. But then we realized that actually there are some cases of jade that are nephrite, right? So then we can define jade, this substance jade, as either jadeite or nephrite, right? So that's a disjunctive definition where we say it's either this or it's that. But sometimes that's not helpful, especially if the definition, this disjunctive definition, is going to contain numerous different disjuncts, right? This looks like it's the case for food, especially if we allow for all the possible as well as actual substances that could be used to nourish an animal. So what we actually have in a disjunctive definition of food now is substance one, or substance two, or substance three, or substance four, five, six, seven, all the way to N, whatever that is. So you see the point here, right? Some of these might count as the actual substances that we know provides nourishment for us. But then we have to also allow for the possible substances that we don't yet know provide nourishment for us. And that looks like it's going to be a very, very quite complicated long string of disjunctive substances. It gets all the more worse once we allow for logically possible substances as well. So I think you can kind of get the picture here where it's very difficult to actually give a definition insofar as this long string of substances seems to be never ending, right? Certainly, this definition, this disjunctive definition, would be incomplete. We would not have a complete analysis of what food is in this particular case. So maybe instead of thinking about food in terms of this natural kind, instead we could think about it in terms of a functional kind, where again, a functional kind or a functional term or concept is going to be whatever function it plays in a system, whatever causally functional role it's performing in that system. So we can say it's a category of things defined by the role or function they perform in that system. So what makes something a member of a functional kind is what it does, not the material stuff, whether it's biological or otherwise, right? So it doesn't really matter how many possible substances would be included now. We can account for all of them, even the ones we have no idea about or the ones we will never know about. It doesn't matter because we're not interested in the actual physical stuff. Instead, we're interested in the role that it plays in the system. So here are some examples that I think will help us understand what we mean by a functional kind. One would be the heart. The heart is defined as the organ that pumps blood in the human body, right? Whether it's a biological heart, whether it's an artificial heart, or even maybe a mechanical heart, mechanical pump. What matters is that it performs the function of circulating blood. It doesn't matter what it's made out of. Or consider the example of a chair. A chair is defined functionally as anything that's being used to sit on, regardless of what it might be made out of. It might be made out of wood or plastic, or it might just be a large stone that you're sitting on. It doesn't matter what the physical stuff is, as long as that physical stuff can perform the right function, the right role in that system. So, take for example something like air or water, right? Water would not be the sort of thing that could be used as a chair because if you sit on water, you will sink. Ditto for air. Air isn't the right sort of physical stuff. It's not the right substrate, if you will, for performing the function of a chair. Because if you sit on air, you will fall. So while it doesn't necessarily matter what the actual physical stuff is, it does have to be the sort of thing that can play the right causal functional role in that particular system. Another really famous example, at least in the philosophy of mind, is pain. A lot of philosophers define pain functionally as a mental state that causes various avoidance behavior. So, for instance, when you withdraw your hand from a hot stove, right, that is one way of understanding what pain is. Or when you stub your toe and you start, or let's say you stub your toe and you start screaming and shouting and cursing, right? That would be another kind of pain behavior. It wouldn't be the actual physical stuff that composes the brain. Rather, it's the behavior, whatever is performing the right kind of causal functional role for that behavior. And notice that you could have some sort of non-human animal, some organism, maybe like a perhaps an octopus, that has a completely different sort of nervous system than what we have. Nonetheless, it could still be in pain if the right thing is performing the right causal functional role in that system, then it will count as pain. So that's what we mean here by a functional term or a functional kind. So maybe then we can think of food as a functional kind. We would say in this sense then that food is whatever performs the function of nourishing us, right? We would say food is defined in terms of the role that it plays in the physical process of ingesting and digesting various substances, no matter what those substances happen to be. It's the functional role here that matters, not the substances. But not everything, notice, will play the right functional role of nourishing us. Intuitively, is going to count as being food. We already saw the example of poop, but we might also use other examples like pets or people, right? My pet, my dog Athena, is not food, even though it technically could count as nourishing us. People, human flesh, is not, I think most people would agree, going to count as food, even though it technically would perform the functional role of nourishing us. Notice also that not all food actually plays the functional role of nourishing us, right? There are plenty of things that we do that count as being food, but do not simply nourish us. Things like eating food for entertainment, or eating food as some sort of an emotional response, or eating food as a part of cultural practice or maybe religious practice, right? So there's going to be some things that we do count as food, but don't have the functional role of nourishing us. Likewise, there are things that we eat that have no nutritional role at all. There's things that have no nutritional value in that regard. So again, it looks like a functional kind is not going to capture the essence of what food is. So far, it seems that we cannot simply appeal to a dictionary definition of food, or the natural kind approach alone is not going to work. And thinking of food in terms of a functional kind, that approach alone will not work. And so we're stuck at a sort of impasse. What is it that we should say about food? How should we define food if none of these approaches are going to work? Well, according to Pelagius, she says these complications arise because of food's role. It goes beyond nourishing us. There are things that nourish us that we don't eat, And there are things that we eat that aren't nutritious. Instead, food as a category seems to depend on our attitudes and our practices in ways that things like gold or water or jade do not. So it looks like our metaphysical analysis of food needs to account for the place it plays in our social practices and our cultural identity. We cannot leave that out. Again, Plakus says food is treated a certain way, ingested at certain times and in certain contexts, and has a certain meaning. So that suggests then that maybe we should be thinking of food not in terms of the physical stuff that it's made out of or the functional role that it plays, but maybe food is really kind of essentially tied to the social aspects, what food is in our society, in our culture. So that will be what we turn to in the next video.